The call came on a Tuesday morning in early October, just before 7, while I was standing at the kitchen window of my cottage with a mug of coffee in one hand and 40 years of quiet in the other. The lake was still. The birch trees on the far shore had gone gold overnight, the way they do in Muskoka when the season turns without asking permission. Grace used to say that October was the lake's way of putting on its best dress before going to sleep for the winter. I thought about that every year when the leaves came down. My son's name lit up on my phone. I smiled, thinking maybe he wanted to bring the kids up for Thanksgiving. We hadn't had a family weekend at the cottage since Grace passed. Dad. His voice had that edge to it, the one I recognized from childhood, when he'd broken something and hadn't decided yet whether to confess or deflect. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it all the way through before you say anything. I set the mug down on the counter. Good morning to you too, Shane. The cottage, a pause. I've listed it. I didn't speak. Actually, it's more than listed. I accepted an offer last week. It closed yesterday. The buyers are a development group out of Toronto. They paid $2.8 million. He said it quickly, the way people do when they want the number to cushion the news. They want to start site prep before the ground freezes, which means they need the property vacant. Dad, I need you out by the end of the month. I turned away from the window. My eyes moved across the room. The mounted lake trout Grace and I caught the summer after we were married. Our first season at this cottage. Back when we were young enough to think a leaky aluminum boat was an adventure. The stone fireplace we rebuilt ourselves one spring after the chimney cracked. The shelf where every summer I had stacked the same worn paperbacks, and Grace had restacked them in alphabetical order without saying a word, and I had unstacked them again, and that had been our quiet, unspoken argument for 32 years. Shane, I said carefully, the cottage is in your name, but it is not yours to sell. Dad, you transferred it to me 6 years ago. You said yourself it was cleaner for estate planning. You didn't want it tied up in probate. I transferred the title, yes. Then it's mine. I had every right. You're going to want to stop talking now, I said, and I'm going to need you to give me a moment. There was silence on the line. Then, Dad, I know this is a shock. I know you love that place, but it's just property. My wife and I have been underwater for 2 years. The mortgage on our house in Aurelia, the line of credit, her student loans, we've been drowning. This was the only asset that could get us clear. You can find a nice condo somewhere, or a retirement place. There are good ones in Barrie, in Collingwood. I hung up. I stood there for a long time looking at the lake. 40 acres of Muskoka waterfront, 300 feet of shoreline. Grace had grown up spending summers 2 lakes over. We had bought this property the year our son started school, back when Muskoka was still within reach of a high school teacher and a nurse, before the whole region became a luxury market for people with Toronto money. We spent 30 summers here. Our granddaughter learned to swim off that dock. I had scattered Grace's ashes in the garden behind the old maple tree, and every morning on my way to get the paper, I said good morning to her. My son had sold it in a phone call. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. I sat down in the armchair by the fireplace, the same chair where I had spent 15 years sitting on winter weekends, marking student papers, reading to Grace when her eyes got tired. I had taught secondary school mathematics for 34 years. People assumed that meant I was gentle and patient. That was true. What they did not assume was that it also meant I was meticulous, that I understood systems, procedures, documentation, that I had never signed anything without reading it 3 times first. My son had forgotten that. I took a slow breath. Then I picked up my phone and called the one number I hadn't dialed in 3 years. Harry picked up on the second ring. Al. His voice was warm and unhurried. Harry had practiced real estate law in Ontario for 38 years before retiring to Huntsville. We had been friends since our boys played in the same Pee-wee hockey league in the late 90s. Don't tell me you're finally going to let me beat you at cribbage. Not today, Harry. I need a favor. I paused. I need you to pull up a parcel register for me. Muskoka District. PIN 480890184. Registered to Shane David Morrow. A brief silence. The sound of a chair shifting. What are we looking for? There should be a life interest notation in the instrument list, registered separately from the transfer deed. I had my lawyer file it the same week I transferred the title 6 years ago. I want to confirm it's still on record. Another silence, longer this time. Al, Harry said finally, what did your son do? He sold the property, accepted an offer, says it closed yesterday. The silence that followed was the silence of a man understanding the full shape of a problem without needing it spelled out further. The buyer, Harry said. Who are they? Development group out of Toronto. He said 2.8 million. Harry let out a careful breath. Alf. If the life interest is registered and the buyer's title search didn't pick it up, then they purchased a property encumbered by my right of occupancy for the remainder of my natural life, I said. They cannot develop. They cannot demolish. They cannot so much as put up a fence without my written consent. And my son represented the title as clean. That's fraudulent misrepresentation. At minimum. He called back in 18 minutes. The life interest was there, exactly where I had left it. Instrument number ER347291. Registered January 14, 2020. Filed as a secondary instrument under the PIN, cross-referenced by instrument number rather than by name. The buyer's lawyer had ordered a standard sub-search focused on the transfer history and outstanding mortgages. The life interest, filed under a separate instrument number, had been missed. They had paid $2.8 million for a piece of land they could not touch without my permission. They did not know that yet. I spent the rest of that Tuesday making one more call. A man named Brian Kowalski, who had done investigative work for the school board's legal counsel for most of my career, and who had the kind of methodical patience you would expect from a former OPP detective. I told him what I needed. I drove to meet him at a Tim Hortons on the highway south of Gravenhurst, 40 minutes from the cottage. I wore my old fleece jacket and a cap. I did not look like a man who had spent 34 years teaching young people to think carefully, and a further 6 years quietly protecting everything he had built. I looked like a retired grandfather, which was exactly what I wanted. Brian was already at a corner table with a large coffee and a manila folder when I arrived. He was a compact man with a gray crew cut and the permanent expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the ways families come apart. I ran preliminary financials on your son and his wife the moment you called, he said, sliding the folder across the table. You were right to be concerned. The picture was not pretty. My son and his wife had accumulated a debt load of just over $700,000, a second mortgage on their home, 2 personal lines of credit, and what appeared to be a private loan arranged entirely outside any regulated lending institution. That last item was on page 3. The loan was listed under a numbered company, 847293 Ontario Inc., in the amount of $380,000. Taken out 19 months ago. Interest terms not disclosed in any public filing. Maturity date, November 30th. Do we know who's behind the numbered company? I asked. Brian tapped the page. Registered director is a man named Curtis Webb. He operates out of a commercial unit in North Barrie, not affiliated with any chartered bank or regulated lender. One civil judgment against him in the past 4 years, and a history with the Financial Services Regulatory Authority for unlicensed lending activity. He has a reputation for being very persistent when accounts go past due. I set the folder down. My son had not sold the cottage because he was struggling with ordinary debt. He had sold it because he was out of time, and the fastest asset he could liquidate was one he believed was cleanly in his name. The word believed was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Monitor the account, I told Brian. I want to know the moment the wire from the developer clears into my son's account, and I want to know immediately where it goes after that. Brian nodded. And if the web payment goes out first? Then my son is no longer in physical danger, I said, which means I can focus entirely on the legal situation. I drove back to the cottage as the sun went down over the water. I sat by the fireplace with Harry's parcel register printout in my lap and thought about the afternoon 6 years ago when I had sat in my lawyer's office and had the life interest filed. Grace had been with me. She had asked whether I really thought it was necessary, whether I truly believed Shane might someday do something like this. I told her I hoped I was wrong. She squeezed my hand and said she hoped so too. I spent 6 years hoping I was wrong about my son. I was not wrong. That evening I called Shane. He answered carefully, "Dad, I'm not going to make a scene," I said. "I understand you were in a difficult position. I'll start going through some of my things this week." Relief bled into his voice immediately. "Dad, I'm really glad you're being reasonable about this. I know it's a lot to process, but it really is just property. You can make a home somewhere else. And the money, it's going to let us finally breathe again." "Of course," I said, "just property." "The development team is coming up Saturday morning to walk the site. They want to look at the shoreline setback before they finalize anything. Would it be all right if we came up Friday evening, just to see what needs to be moved out?" "That's perfectly fine," I said. "I'll be here." He sounded so relieved he said goodnight almost warmly, almost like my son. I set the phone down and looked at the fire for a long time. Saturday, that gave me 3 days, it was enough. The next morning I drove to Harry's house in Huntsville. He had his dining room table cleared with the parcel register printout and the original transfer instrument side by side, along with a copy of the relevant provisions of the Ontario Land Titles Act. "The registration is unassailable," Harry told me. He had the measured delivery of a man who had spent 4 decades choosing words the way a carpenter chooses joints. "The life interest predates the transfer and registration sequence. It was filed at 9:12 a.m. The transfer deed was registered at 2:47 p.m. the same day, on my advice, to ensure priority. Under the Land Titles Act, a registered interest takes precedence according to registration sequence. Your life interest attaches to the property regardless of any subsequent conveyance." "And the development group." Harry exhaled slowly. "They are going to be furious. They have paid $2.8 million for a property they cannot develop without your written consent. Their project depends on breaking ground before freeze-up. That window is 6 weeks away at most. If they miss it, their construction financing lapses, their approvals have to be renewed, and their entire business case for this acquisition falls apart." "Good." Harry looked at me over his glasses. "What do you want to happen Saturday?" "I want to be at the cottage when my son and the development team arrive," I said. "I want you there with me. I'd like an OPP officer present, as a witness, someone I'm not asking to do anything, just to be there. I know Sergeant Weeby at the Gravenhurst detachment. He owes me a favor from a property dispute I helped him understand few years back. And I want to be wearing my suit." Harry allowed himself a small smile. "The dark charcoal." "The one I wore to Grace's retirement dinner," I said. "Yes." I spent Thursday at the cottage not packing. I had no intention of leaving, but moving through the rooms the way you do when you need to remind yourself of everything that's at stake. My father's fishing rods, still hanging in the shed, the wooden chest where Grace kept her gardening catalogs, the faded sampler her mother had cross-stitched above the kitchen door, the photograph on the mantel of the two of us standing on the dock in 1987, young and squinting into the sun, with no idea how many mornings we would stand in that same spot without ever thinking to count them. Thursday evening, Brian called. The wire transfer had cleared at 3:45 in the afternoon. $2.8 million had landed in my son's joint account. Within 90 minutes, $394,000 had been transferred to 87293 Ontario Inc. Curtis Webb had his money. My son's debt was settled. By 8 o'clock, another $60,000 had gone to a property management company in Kelowna. First month and deposit on a condo rental in British Columbia. They were already celebrating. They were already gone in their minds. I sat by the fire that night with a glass of rye whiskey and the formal notice Harry had prepared, a declaration of life interest, notarized and ready to be served. I thought about the years I had spent being a father rather than a man who understood his rights. I had been patient. I had transferred the property in good faith, given money twice without keeping score, softened every landing I could reach. I had believed that generosity, offered freely enough and long enough, would eventually teach gratitude. I was wrong. Generosity without accountability teaches nothing except the expectation of more. The fire burned low. I went to bed at 10 o'clock and slept better than I had in weeks. My son and his wife arrived Friday evening with overnight bags, and the careful cheerfulness of people trying not to look directly at what they had done. We had dinner. We were polite. I showed them nothing. Saturday morning I was dressed by 7, the charcoal suit, A white shirt, my good shoes, the cufflinks Grace had given me on our 30th anniversary. Plain silver, our initials engraved on the backs where no one could see them but me. Harry arrived at 7:30 with his briefcase, and the quiet expression of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and was not worried about this one. Sergeant Weeby arrived at 8 in a marked OPP cruiser. He was a broad, unhurried man who had spent 21 years in this district and who understood that some situations require a uniform and a witness and nothing else. At 20 past 8, two vehicles turned off the municipal road and down my gravel drive. The first was my son's leased SUV. Behind it, a black truck with the Toronto Development Company's logo on the door. 3 men in construction jackets climbed out of the truck. My son and his wife climbed out of the SUV. My son was wearing the casual confidence of someone who believes a difficult chapter is already closed. My daughter-in-law had on new boots and a wool coat I had not seen before. They were talking and laughing with the lead developer, a thick-shouldered man named Hargrove, the kind of handshake that closes deals rather than starts conversations. And for a moment, watching from the kitchen window, I felt the full weight of what was about to happen. Then I thought about the phone call on Tuesday morning. I stepped outside. The effect was immediate. My son stopped walking mid-sentence. The confidence on his face flickered when he saw the suit. It flickered harder when he saw Harry standing beside me with a briefcase. It went out entirely when he registered the OPP cruiser in the drive. "Dad," his voice had lost its certainty. "What's going on? Why is there a police officer here?" I walked toward the group at an easy pace. I looked at Hargrove. "I assume you're leading the development team." Hargrove looked from me to my son. "That's right. And you are?" "My name is Albert Morrow," I said. "I'm a retired educator and the registered holder of a life interest on this property. I thought it was worth meeting before your team invested any more time discussing site preparation." The silence that followed was the kind that settles over a space when everyone in it simultaneously realizes the ground has shifted. Hargrove turned to my son slowly. "What life interest?" My son's face had gone the color of old ash. "Dad, you transferred the property to me 6 years ago. Cleaned transfer. I have the instrument number." "You have one of the registered instruments," I said. "Harry." Harry stepped forward and handed the development team the certified copy of the life interest registration. Hargrove took it. He scanned the first line. He read it again. "The life interest was registered at 9:12 a.m. on January 14, 2020, Harry said, with the quiet precision of a man who has done this 100 times. "The transfer deed was registered the same day at 2:47 p.m. Under the Ontario Land Titles Act, registration sequence determines priority. Mr. Morrow's life interest takes precedence over any subsequent conveyance. He holds the legal right of occupancy on this property for the duration of his natural life. No development activity may proceed without his explicit written consent." Hargrove looked up from the document. He looked at my son. Whatever warmth had been in his manner was entirely gone. "You represented this title as unencumbered," he said flatly. My son's mouth opened. I didn't know. He never told me specifically about. "You had a legal obligation to order a full sub-search before representing the title," Harry said. "A standard ownership search focused on the primary deed chain would miss a secondary encumbrance filed under a separate instrument number. A comprehensive search would not. You chose the faster option because you needed the transaction to close quickly." My daughter-in-law put her hand on my son's arm. "Call our lawyer," she said quietly. "Your lawyer is going to tell you exactly what my colleague just told you," I said, not unkindly. "You sold a property you could not legally convey, free and clear. Mr. Hargrove's group paid $2.8 million for a parcel. They cannot develop without my cooperation. Whether that constitutes negligent misrepresentation or something more serious is a question for the courts. In either case, it is actionable." Hargrove was already on his phone. I heard the words title encumbrance, legal hold, and get Toronto on the line right now. My son turned to me. It was the first time since Tuesday morning that he looked at me the way he used to when he was a boy. Not with the impatience of someone managing a difficult parent, but with something close to fear, and under the fear, with something that was close to shame. "Dad," he said, "please." I waited. "I know I was wrong. I know how this looks. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. But you can fix this right now. Sign a waiver. The life interest is removed, the title clears, the sale stands. They keep the property, we keep the money. Everyone walks away whole. Please, Dad, just sign the paper. My daughter-in-law moved beside him. Albert, we should have come to you first. We know that. We were frightened and we panicked and we made a terrible decision. But you have the power to make this right for everyone. Please don't let one mistake define everything. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter-in-law. I looked past them at the lake, at the dock, at the old maple tree, at the edge of the garden where Grace's ashes were scattered. One mistake, I said. They nodded. Not calling me, I said. Not sitting down with me. Not giving me the basic courtesy of a conversation before selling the property where your mother's ashes are resting. My son flinched. You told me it was just property. You told me I could find something in Barry or Collingwood. You had already decided what my home was worth, and you made that calculation without me. I paused. What you're asking me to do right now is absorb every consequence of your decision so that you feel none of them. That is not mercy. That is you asking me to take the fall a second time. Hargrove came off his phone. He walked directly to my son, his voice businesslike and cold. Our legal team has confirmed the encumbrance. The transaction is voidable on grounds of material misrepresentation. We are initiating clawback proceedings on the wire transfer effective immediately. Your financial institution will receive a legal hold notice before end of business today. Any funds already dispersed are your personal liability. We will be pursuing full recovery through civil action, and depending on what our title insurance carrier decides, there may be a referral to the appropriate authorities. My daughter-in-law made a sound that was not quite a word. My son looked like the ground had opened beneath him. The Webb payment, she said, almost to herself. We paid Webb yesterday. We already paid him. Then you have a problem, Hargrove said, without sympathy. My son turned to me one final time. His eyes were wet. He was standing in the driveway of the cottage where he had learned to cast a rod and read a map and lose gracefully at cribbage, and he was asking me to save him from himself. Dad, he said, and his voice broke on the single syllable. I'm sorry, I mean it. I was selfish and scared and I didn't think it through. I'm not asking you to pretend it was okay. I'm asking you to forgive me because you're my father. I had been thinking about forgiveness since Tuesday. What it actually means. Not the kind that dissolves consequences, not the version that resets the account to zero and lets everyone pretend it never happened. The kind that requires the person asking for it to stand in the full weight of what they did, without flinching, and still be standing when it's over. I forgive you, Shane, I said. I mean that genuinely. He exhaled, his shoulders dropped. But forgiveness is not a transaction, I said. It does not come with a waiver attached. You need to face what you did. Not because I want you to suffer, because you will spend the rest of your life making the same choices if you don't understand the cost of this one. I looked at Sergeant Weeb. He gave a small nod. I'm not pressing for criminal charges, I said. I told Harry that before any of you arrived. But I am not signing a waiver. The life interest stands. The transaction remains defective. Hargrove's group will pursue whatever remedy they choose, and you will answer for it. That is not punishment. That is consequence. My son sat down on the front step of the cottage. Not chose to sit, but sat down, the way you do when your legs decide before you do. My daughter-in-law stood beside him with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the lake. The development team was already walking the property line in low, urgent conversation. Their truck idled in the drive. The site work that was supposed to begin this week would not begin at all. Harry came to stand beside me. What happens to them now? He asked quietly. They'll face a civil suit, I said. They'll work through it. My son is not a stupid man. He is reckless, but he's not stupid. He'll find a way to settle with Hargrove's group, sell the car, take the smaller apartment, do the slow, unglamorous work of cleaning up a mess he made. I paused. Whether it teaches him anything depends on whether he does the work honestly or just waits for the next shortcut. I walked inside and made 2 cups of coffee. Then I carried them both outside and set one down on the step beside my son. He looked up at me. Drink your coffee, I said. He stared at it for a moment. Then he picked it up with both hands. I pulled the wooden chair from beside the door and sat down. The lake was perfectly still, the way Muskoka gets in October, when the summer people are gone and it's just the loons and the cold and the smell of wood smoke drifting in from somewhere across the water. After a long while, my son said quietly, "I didn't know about Mom, about the maple tree." "I know you didn't." He looked at the garden. "I want to say I would have done something different if I'd known. I want to believe I'm not the kind of person who—" He stopped. "Then be the person who wouldn't have," I said. He looked at me. "How do I start?" "Call Hargrove's lawyers on Monday morning, before they call you," I said. "Tell them you want to discuss a structured repayment, sell the SUV, take the smaller apartment, do the boring, unglamorous work of cleaning up a mess you made, and when you come out the other side of it, you will know something about yourself that you don't know right now." "What's that?" "That you can survive the fall," I said. "Most people spend their entire lives maneuvering around it. They borrow and cut corners and make panicked phone calls at 7 in the morning because they are terrified of what happens if they hit the ground. The moment you know you can hit it and get back up, it loses its power over you." My daughter-in-law wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It was the most unguarded I had seen her in years. My son set his empty mug down on the step. He looked at the maple tree at the edge of the garden. "Can I go over there?" he asked. "To Mom's tree?" "Of course you can," I said. "This is still your family's land." He stood up slowly and walked across the lawn with his hands in his pockets. My daughter-in-law followed him. I watched them stand together under the old maple, not talking, just standing in the pale October light with the lake behind them and the cold coming in off the water. I went inside and stood at the kitchen window. My coffee was warm in my hands. I thought about Grace. I thought about the afternoon 6 years ago when we sat in the lawyer's office and had the life interest filed. She had asked me whether I really thought it was necessary. I told her I hoped I was wrong. She squeezed my hand and said she hoped so too. I had spent 6 years hoping I was wrong about my son. I was not wrong. But standing at the window watching him stand under his mother's tree, I thought that wrong was not the only thing a person could be. The distance between where my son was standing this morning and who he was capable of becoming might be exactly as wide as the lesson he had just been handed. I had given him every advantage I could. I had cleared paths and softened landings and transferred money without keeping score, and I had raised a man who called his father's home just property when the bill came due. The one thing I had never given him was accountability. You cannot transfer it through estate planning. You cannot buy it or soften it or wish it into someone's character. It has to be earned, and the learning only sticks when the cost is real. I set my mug in the sink, I put on my jacket and walked outside. I crossed the lawn to the maple tree and stood near my son and my daughter-in-law without saying anything. After a while, my son looked at me. "I'm going to fix it," he said. His voice was steady, or trying to be. "I don't have a plan yet, but I'm going to fix it." I nodded. "I know you are." We stood together under Grace's tree for a while longer, the three of us in the October cold, with the lake catching the last of the morning light, and the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that still had to happen, sitting quietly among us. The cottage was still standing. My son was still my son. The rest of it was just work. If you have ever had to watch someone you love walk straight into the consequences of their own choices and had to stop yourself from stepping in front of them, you know what that morning felt like. It is one of the hardest things a parent does, and one of the most necessary. I spent 34 years in a classroom teaching young people that the answer you arrive at through your own effort is the only one that actually stays with you. I should have applied that same principle to my own son much sooner. The most lasting thing I ever gave him was not this cottage, not the years of quiet generosity, not the money I never tracked. It was this, a morning in October when I held the line and let the weight of it do the teaching that love alone never could. If that speaks to something you have been through yourself, leave a comment below. I read everyone. And if you believe that real strength sometimes means holding the line even when it costs you something, hit that like button and subscribe to Revenge Hours. I will be back next week with another story.